you mentioned that you thought there's a legitimate scientific project to investigate where the limits of human understanding lie. So whether a question is beyond our ability to answer. I just wonder what kind of evidence or inquiry do you think would be relevant to that? So just an example, in philosophy, Colin McGinn holds the view that the nature of consciousness or the explanatory gap, that's something that human beings are just never going to be able to answer. And I guess there's some affinity between his position and what you say. But then an objection to him that I'm sympathetic to is that, well, how do you know we cannot know? How do you know that if you give human beings 10,000 years, suppose that we haven't gone extinct by then, how do you know that you give 10,000 years, people aren't going to come up with new concepts that they don't now have? So how do you know that they are not going to be able to solve it? So I just wonder if you think there's a scientific evidence for this question. What kind of evidence would that be?
Well, first of all, we're talking about empirical questions. And in the case of empirical questions, you never know with certainty. That's what makes them empirical questions. Otherwise, they'd be questions of logic or maybe arithmetic. And even there, you can ask questions. But if it's empirical, we're never going to know with certainty. That's for sure. That's true by definition. So the question really is, what evidence do we have and how good is the evidence? Well, in some cases, the evidence is pretty good. Like take the classical case, what Newton regarded as an absurdity. And again, I think you have to take people like Newton seriously, and Hume and Huygens and the rest of them. What they regarded as an absurdity is that there could be influence without contact. And while we don't know with certainty that that's the limits of human intelligence, there's pretty good evidence. If you study, first of all, we just have it from our own intuitions and from the history of centuries of efforts by the leading scientists to try to do something to overcome it, finally ending in failure and abandoning the quest. And we also know it, are beginning to understand it from just the experimental study of infants, children, things of the kind that I mentioned. They reflexively seek some kind of contact in order to account for correlations. Doesn't make sense otherwise. Well, physicists have finally given that up. They say, look, we're never going to find it. It doesn't exist. But how strong is that evidence? Well, you decide how strong it is. It looks pretty compelling to me. And if it is really the limits of our understanding, then nothing's going to change in 10,000 years, just as it didn't change in the last 50,000. What about things beyond that? Well, it's not an easy question to ask, even about other creatures like rats. But you can investigate it. Are you ever going to get certainty? No, you'll never have certainty because it's an empirical investigation. So that you don't bother looking for. As far as consciousness is concerned, it's a very hot topic these days. In fact, in philosophy, it's called the hard problem. Everything else is an easy problem somehow. But this is the hard problem. You go back to the 17th and 18th century, they also had something called the hard problem. Namely, how is motion possible? That was the hard problem. I mentioned, Newton wrestled with it, finally said it's impossible. We just have to accept it, even though we can't find what he called a physical cause. That was called the hard rock in philosophy. Voltaire, dedicated Newtonian, said that the fact that humans can cause motion by thought, like I can think, I want my hand to go over here and something will move. He said that's so inexplicable that it's got to be divine intervention. He was, of course, a pretty dedicated atheist by the standards of the time. But it looks as if we're stuck with that. And there seem to be, if we look further, there are many other things. Take, say, language, which is easier to study. There are impossible languages. You can construct things that look, symbol sequences, which are given interpretations and so on, but which have a structure that humans cannot learn. I mean, they may deal with it as a puzzle of some kind, but they can't deal with it as a linguistic task. There's by now pretty good experimental data on that. Well, that's the kind of thing you expect to find when you look at any organism, including our other cognitive capacities. As far as consciousness is concerned, I'm not so convinced that it's the hard problem. First of all, you have to formulate it coherently. What's the problem? I mean, I quoted Francis Crick, I didn't mention him, as saying that he has an astonishing hypothesis that consciousness comes from activity of the brain. That's Locke, Hume. I mean, yes, they took that for granted. So that's the astonishing hypothesis. And then you can go to proceed, as he and others have done, to ask what's going on in the brain when people are conscious. Okay, that's serious work. Does it answer suppose you could get all those questions answered. Does it tell you what consciousness is? No, it leaves open the questions of consciousness. And in fact, we might ultimately be reduced to something like what Bertrand Russell thought. You'd read his analysis of matter, for example, which unfortunately isn't read much, but it's important, I think. I think it's 1928 or so. He says, look, the only thing we have any confidence in is our immediate consciousness. We may be wrong about it, but at least we have some degree of confidence in it. Everything else is intellectual construction, including our conception of objects, our theory of the world, and so on. So that's, if you want, the hard rock, not too hard because it could be wrong, but that's what we have to start with. And it's the best you can do as humans.